Rulers of Africa in the 16th century, much like everywhere else in the known world, favoured male kings. But in one area of southwest Africa, a queen would become so renowned for her intelligence, her political aptitude, and her military skills that even today she is still an icon in Angola and throughout Africa. That queen was Nzinga Mabande. Queen Nzinga Mabande was born around 1583 into the royal family of Ndongo, an area of West Africa today known as Angola. Her father was Mbandi Kiluanji and her mother was Kengela Ka Nikombe. Kengela was a concubine of the king, but he openly favoured her over his principal wife. She had already given birth to a boy named Mabande after his father, who was destined to be king. But her daughter's birth was more difficult, and the baby had the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. Thankfully, the royal attendants were able to unravel the cord and safely deliver the baby. According to legend, royal children who survived a difficult birth were believed to have spiritual gifts and were likely to mean a great and unusual life in some way. Even her name supposedly came from her birth, as Nzinga came from the Kimbundu verb kujinga, meaning to twist or turn. She was clearly her father's favourite child from the start. When Nzinga was 10 years old, her father ascended to the throne, becoming Ngola Mabande Kiluanji, Ngola roughly translating as king. As a girl, as well as being the child of a concubine, Nzinga wasn't an heir to the throne, so she wasn't seen as competition for her brothers. As a result, her father lavished attention on her and kept her by his side at legal councils and important rituals of their culture. Most surprisingly, Nzinga even received military training, showing great skill with a battle axe, the traditional weapon of Ndongan warriors. This was all against the background of crisis and war, however. In the period when Nzinga's father became king, the Ndongan people were involved in conflicts, mostly with the Portuguese. The ties with the Portuguese had first begun in 1575, when a trading post was established in Luanda. Unfortunately, it was done with the help of the Kingdom of Congo, rivals of Ndongo to the north. Because of this, a previously peaceful relationship with Portugal now deteriorated into war. By the 1580s, with the help of the Kingdom of Congo, Portugal had seized large swathes of Ndongan land. The Portuguese forces were brutal, burning villages and taking hostages for the slave trade. One source stated that it was as many as 50,000 people taken. Forts were built inside the snatched Ndongan land in order to control the slave trade from within. Years passed until finally Ndongo defeated the Portuguese at the Battle of Lucala in 1590. The damage had been done, however. Before the defeat, several nobles, known as Sobas, had sided with Portugal, also meaning that the Ndongan kingdom no longer had their money helping stabilise the economy and that their soldiers would now join the Portuguese. In 1593, when Nzinga's father took the throne, there was little left of Ndongan lands, and his power was diminished from what it could have been. The Imbangala, a militarised group of nomadic people, now became the newest ally of Portugal. They had attacked Ndongo for years, but now they stepped up their campaign. The Imbangala wanted their slice of the Ndongan lands, and the Portuguese wanted to take the remaining refugees as slaves. In 1617, Nzinga's situation grew worse when her father died and his son, Ngola Mabande, came to power. it was not a peaceful takeover of the throne. A successor was chosen through a complex set of rules, both in being of a noble lineage, of which there could literally be hundreds of claimants, as kings often had many concubines, and being chosen by a council of court officials. In the months that followed, Mbandi killed many of his rivals for the throne, including his older half-brother and his entire family. Mbandi himself shared the same parents as Nzinga, so was the son of a concubine, whereas his elder brother was son of the king's chief wife. Sadly, Nzinga and her two sisters, Fungi and Kambu, although allowed to remain alive, were not spared from his violence. Nzinga and Mbandi had a long-standing sibling rivalry that seems to have allowed for no kindness between them. Although Nzinga was now 35 years old and unlikely, as a woman, to be a threat to the throne, Mbandi ordered all 3 women to be forcibly sterilized. This was done by throwing boiling oil and herbs onto their bellies so that they would be unable to give birth again from the shock, fear and pain. While there are no eyewitness accounts to this, Nzinga and her sisters did not have any more children after 1617. What made this even worse was that Nzinga had a young newborn son, fathered by one of her male concubines, and Mbandi took the baby and murdered him. Fearing for what might happen next, Nzinga fled and retreated to the kingdom of Matamba, where she was given refuge. Mbandi attempted to claw his kingdom back from the Portuguese by opting for war over diplomacy. However, his military skill was lacking and he failed to make an alliance with the Imbangala. At the same time, a new governor, Luis Mendes de Vasconcelos, was in place and wanted to make his mark with a massive military campaign designed to take all Ndongan lands and pay for the war by selling the thousands of hostages as slaves. Losing even more land, Mbandi turned to his sister Nzinga, amazingly asking her to be his ambassador to the Portuguese. Nzinga was of a royal bloodline and she spoke fluent Portuguese. The fact he had murdered her young son and sterilized her don't seem to have caused him a problem in asking, but later events suggest Nzinga used the opportunity to put her revenge into play. Accepting her brother's proposal also meant she could work on her own political ambitions. Nzinga agreed to do the diplomatic mission on 2 conditions. One, that she was able to negotiate on behalf of the king, and 2, that she had permission to be baptized if necessary. She planned to use this as a bargaining tool. She departed from the capital, Kabasa, with a large retinue made up of a military escort, musicians, pages and waiting women, as well as, ironically for what would come later, slaves for the governor. Nzinga had even been given a new title of official envoy. When her party arrived at Luanda's gates, they were the talk of the town, and the Portuguese in turn showed them great respect. A Portuguese military escort took them into the main square, where they were greeted by the entire business, administrative and religious elites of the city. For her part, Nzinga would have been expected to dress in European-style clothes, but instead she chose to dress in the opulent traditional clothing of her people, complete with jewels and feathers. She was out to prove that her culture was not inferior. The idea the Ndongan culture was inferior was further pushed when she arrived at her first meeting. Chairs had been placed out for the governor and his council, but only a simple mat for Nzinga. To get around this, one of her female attendants dropped to her hands and knees and fashioned herself into a chair for Nzinga to sit on. It may seem a little extreme and perhaps even a bit comical, but it was a snub to the Portuguese, attempting to treat Nzinga as unequal to themselves, and to their attitudes towards Africans in general. But it was her persuasive speech that was the highlight of the meeting with the Governor's Council. Nzinga promised her brother Angola Mbande would live peacefully alongside the colonists, cease military attacks, and that any Portuguese slaves that had escaped and joined her brother's ranks would be returned. In short, she positioned the Ndongan kingdom as peaceful, but presented her brother's actions so far as inexperienced, youthful indiscretions, with herself as the diplomatic, politically minded elder sister. But she also stood firm on one particular demand, that of tribute of slaves. Nzinga point-blank refused to allow any tribute of slaves to be sent to the Portuguese, as other conquered African rulers had done. Nzinga also demanded any forts built inside Ndongan territory be dismantled. She worded this as stating that Ndongo had not been conquered, and giving slaves was the act of a defeated nation. They were there only to offer friendship on equal footing. This made the governor question their commitment to peace, and so Nzinga used her last diplomatic weapon. She swore to study the Bible and be publicly baptized. This was done in Luanda with great ceremony. The governor's wife, Dona Ana de Silva, had been ordained as her godmother, and the governor himself, Azekhoria de Sousa, was present. Nzinga used a combination of their names for her adoptive Christian name, becoming Ana de Sousa. Flattery was a brilliant tool in her hands. She returned to Cabasa to a joyous welcome, but it wouldn't last long. The delicate peace between the Ndongo and the Imbangala broke down, forcing the royal family to flee the capital and retreat to the Kindonga Islands. There, a Portuguese priest found them to continue the negotiations. The Portuguese promised to remove the Imbangala from Ndongan territory and restore the nobles who had been captured previously once Mbande agreed to convert to Christianity. He managed to recapture the capital Cabasa in 1623 and giving up his concubines and some religious practices of the Mbundu people. Nzinga was already becoming more powerful within the court, and her brother leaned more on her for her judgments in what to do with the Portuguese. She advised him, in what was a political play for revenge, that he should not follow through his conversion with a baptism. She claimed it would be offensive to his Mbundu supporters to bow his head in front of an inferior, the priest, and that becoming Christian would cost him their support, as they admired his stubbornness against the Portuguese. Mbande became convinced of following her advice, especially as he himself did not trust the Portuguese. Eventually, the treaty between them broke down, as the Portuguese began once more to advance into Ndongan territory for slaves. Mbande had sank into a deep depression by the following year in 1624, and handed over many of his duties to Nzinga, who he now trusted more than his other advisors. But in the spring of that year, Mbande died. He had been receiving treatment for his depression from his own religious people, but they had failed to rouse him. Mbande consumed poison in mysterious circumstances, and some claimed Nzinga had helped him drink it down. The Portuguese chronicler Antonio de Cadonega wrote that Nzinga helped him to die with the aid of a poisoned drink. It isn't difficult to imagine Nzinga having gained a powerful position within the Ndongan court, and having allowed the Portuguese to believe she was the reasonable diplomatic sibling who could be dealt with more readily, should seize her opportunity for revenge. Nzinga wasted no time in stepping into her brother's role, taking the throne for herself at the age of 43. Mbandi himself had made it clear that she would be his successor, and she moved to strengthen her position immediately. Her supporters took the ritual objects associated with the Ndongan ruler, and she did as her brother had done before her, eliminating her political opponents at court, including relatives who refused to accept her rule. By 1625, she had grown her court with supporters, as well as growing the islands on the Kwanza River with people from Kabasa. But Nzinga had one other opponent in her way, her brother's son, her 7-year-old nephew. He had been placed, as part of the earlier peace deals, under the guardianship of the Imbangala, much as European royal or noble children were often fostered out to other noble households. His guardian was an Imbangala war chief, Kasa. By September 1625, Nzinga reached out to him, showering him with gifts and using her wealth and charms to convince Kasa she was madly in love with him. At first, he rejected her as he was much younger and knew that she likely just wanted the boy. However, eventually Kasa agreed to the match, and the wedding took place somewhere in Matamba, with her young 7-year-old nephew accompanying his guardian. The ceremony was barely over when Nzinga seized the boy, killed him instantly, and threw his body in the Kwanza River, declaring that she had now avenged her son. Many of her supporters fled, especially when more relatives who disagreed with her position were murdered, but most remained. The Mbundu people regarded her as their legitimate ruler, and therefore her acts, however bloodthirsty, were justified, no different to European rulers who often killed hundreds with public executions. But Nzinga still had to settle the dispute with the Portuguese, and she hoped to build on the Treaty of 1621. The governor de Sousa also wanted a peaceful outcome. However, when Nzinga asked for the return of Kimbares, Ndongan soldiers serving under Portuguese officers, de Sousa threw back that he wanted the return of slaves who had escaped and joined the Ndongan military. Neither would move, and it became a tense stalemate. Nzinga also refused to give in to demands that she become a vassal of Portugal and pay tribute, although it didn't stop de Sousa going after many of the sobas or nobles and forcing them to become vassals. Traditionally, the sobas would pay tribute to the ruler of Ndongo, and now this would be going to Portugal, undermining Nzinga's leadership. But this also bolstered support for her. The nobles who refused to become vassals looked to her for guidance, and by December 1624, many of the sobas who had become vassals, as well as many people enslaved by the Portuguese, had fled to Ndongo. However, her policies also threatened the income for many sobas, and some openly rebelled against her. In late 1625, the Portuguese sent military forces to guard Hari a Kiluanje, a sobas who had openly defied Nzinga's reign on the basis of her policies and the fact she was a woman. When she found out about this, Nzinga sent her own soldiers to crush his revolt, but unfortunately was beaten. This weakened her position, and other nobles who had been on the fence now joined the Portuguese. She tried to negotiate with the Portuguese while she gathered more men to fight, but they correctly guessed it was only a delaying tactic. On March the 8th that year, Nzinga's messengers arrived in Luanda with a letter for the Captain General of the fort at Kambambe, asserting her right to attack her own vassals, Kiluanje, and also that her forces had captured 6 hostages when they attacked him. For the first time, she signed her name both as Ana de Sousa and Queen of Ndongo. It was ignored by the Portuguese. They also recognised Kiluanje, who was also descended from a royal bloodline, as King of Ndongo, then declaring war on Nzinga on the 15th of March 1626. Nzinga had no choice but to take her army and retreat to the Ndongo Islands once more. The battles began around the fort of Kambambe, steadily moving onwards into Ndongan lands, forcing the submission of Sobas along the way. In May, the Portuguese forces finally reached the islands. Only one eyewitness account from a Mabundu soldier gives details of the defences set upon the islands. Nzinga had great trenches dug and artificial caves constructed from the rocks. There weren't enough weapons for her army to use, so instead she had gathered provisions, people and animals to prepare for a siege. The Ndongan forces fought bravely, but it was the Portuguese who emerged victorious, forcing Nzinga and her followers to flee further eastwards. Most of those who had been enslaved by the Portuguese had to be abandoned along the way during her retreat, but this was to her benefit, as the Portuguese aims were to recapture enslaved people, not pursue her and her army. But before fleeing the last island, Nzinga flipped on her earlier decision to be baptized. It was now obvious the Portuguese were not interested in acknowledging her as ruler, especially now they had their own candidate, and so she had no further need of pandering to their spiritual requests in order to be accepted by them. Knowing that she needed to rally her Mabundu supporters to her cause, she used the relics she had in her possession, including those made from the bones of her deceased brother. It was believed that Mabande's spirit became stronger in death than he had been in life, and so her priests called upon him for guidance. His spirit apparently possessed a priest during the ceremony and proclaimed a vassal of the Portuguese was to lose freedom and become a slave, and that Nzinga should keep this freedom by fleeing. But things didn't go well for the Portuguese in the absence of Nzinga either. Their would-be puppet king, Haria Kiluanje, died unexpectedly of smallpox. It left the Portuguese little choice but to replace him with his half-brother, Noglahari. Unfortunately, he was unpopular with the common people, as he was of royal lineage, but his mother had been enslaved, making his own status uncertain. They also didn't appreciate the fact he was a vassal to the Portuguese. A divide opened up between the Ndongan people, allowing Nzinga to exploit this and attempt to once more open negotiations for peace. In November 1627, Nzinga sent a peace delegation with her highest official, her Mwene Lumbo, to the Portuguese, along with the rather awful peace offering of 400 enslaved people for the Portuguese king, and the more acceptable gift of 150 cattle. She finally gave in to their demand that she become a vassal to Portugal, but in return wanted her position as queen supported and rightfully recognised. Her official stated that she was tired of running through her own country and wanted a peaceful end to the war. But de Sousa did not trust Nzinga, and he also knew that the weak Noglahari would be easier to bend to his will as a puppet king, so her negotiations were rejected, and de Sousa declared her Mwene Lumbo a spy and had him arrested. He then ordered that Nzinga should be hunted down and killed, and the heads cut off any Sobas who joined her. His final demand to Nzinga was that she should retire from public life, renounce her claim to the throne, and accept Noglahari as her rightful sovereign. Obviously, Nzinga refused to do this, and instead tried to undermine Noglahari by highlighting his political inexperience and lack of own soldiers. He retaliated by calling in more Portuguese forces, and after another series of battles, by late 1628, Nzinga was reduced to just 200 men, and she had to retreat further from her lands. Alliances had to be made, and it was then that Kasanjay, a powerful Imbangala warlord, reached out to her. He proposed a marriage between them, offering her military support in exchange for her discarding her lunga, a bell used by Ndongan war captains as a symbol of their power. This may seem a small thing, but in agreeing, Nzinga would be giving up the chance to participate in wars herself and would be subordinate to her husband. Surprisingly, she did not hesitate to agree when Kasanjay's messenger returned with these terms, and when she crossed the Kwanza River to go to her new life, she tossed the bell aside into a bush. Nzinga quickly adapted to her new culture and position, and although the sources disagree on the finer details, the consensus among modern historians is that she did have to participate in at least two unsavoury rituals. One, drinking human blood in a blood oath ceremony, and two, the initiation rites for a woman to become a leader in Imbangala society, which included the use of an oil made from a slain baby, the Maji Asamba. However, Nzinga never abandoned her Ndongan roots, and she combined elements of both cultures, bringing them together with the Mabundu people and creating a large, highly capable army. She increased her numbers by giving freedom and land to escaped slaves and titles to her exiled Sobas. By 1631, Nzinga's forces had grown both in number and strength, and the guerrilla war against the Portuguese was finally going in her favour. Over the next 4 years, she ventured into the neighbouring lands of Matamba, taking it, and in 1631, deposing their queen, Mwongo Matamba. She had her branded, but spared her life. It was customary in Imbangala tradition to have a deposed leader executed, so it's clear that Nzinga was treading a fine line, balancing her dual cultures. Nzinga also took Mwongo Matamba's daughter into her own service as one of her warriors. Matamba had an established tradition of female rulers, and so it was easier for Nzinga to claim the defeated lands and place herself as ruler, using it as a power base from which to launch attacks. Unfortunately, Nzinga also re-established and grew the slave trade, using the profits from the enslaved people to fund her war. It was also around this time that she began to take on more masculine elements, perhaps to assure doubters of her equality to a male ruler. She would use the title king instead of queen, dress in male clothing, and created an all-female bodyguard for herself. Most oddly, she ordered that her male concubines should dress in female clothing, and there were rumours that she made them fight to the death for the chance to spend the night with her, before having the winner executed in the morning. The likelihood of this being true is slim, although Nzinga had done many bloodthirsty things. Killing off men when she was trying to grow her numbers seems a stupid move. By the late 1630s, Nzinga had captured many of the lands to the north and south, also taking parts of the Kwanza River and cutting off rulers from Portuguese affairs. As she expanded to the north, she came into increasing contact with the Kingdom of Congo and the Dutch merchants who were establishing themselves there. An alliance was struck, and trade was established between Nzinga and the Dutch. Sadly, this was once again mostly in the slave trade, As many as 13,000 enslaved people a year were sold to the Dutch from Nzinga's kingdom. In 1641, the Dutch captured Luanda, and Nzinga immediately sent an envoy to establish an alliance there. She hoped to form an Afro-Dutch alliance against the Portuguese, which the Dutch readily agreed to. They sent their ambassador and a large military force to her court to aid in her fight. The Portuguese were beaten back by this double onslaught and had to retreat to Masangano. The Portuguese governor, fearing what might happen, tried to broker peace with Nzinga. Not surprisingly, she turned him down. With her new alliance and large army, Nzinga now recaptured parts of Ndongo between 1641 and 1644. By 1644, she had won the support of many Sobas again, but her expansion of lands made other regional rulers wary of her. Nzinga considered only Garcia II of the Congo to be her political equal, and the Portuguese considered Nzinga their biggest threat in Africa. In 1646, they reportedly captured her two sisters, and upon finding out that fungi had been spying for Nzinga and passing Portuguese movements to her, she was drowned in the Kwanza River. By 1648, Nzinga now owned much of Ndongo again, as well as Matamba, and her kingdoms were an economic powerhouse in the region. Now around 65 years old, Nzinga continued to fight the Portuguese, as well as battling Kassa's Imbangala forces to the east with ease, and creating alliances with neighbouring kingdoms. Nzinga also began to use another way to establish her right to rule in the eyes of those outside Africa, by returning to the Christian faith she had rejected. In 1648, her forces captured two Capuchin Spanish friars in the Congo region. They were brought back to Nzinga's court, but she ended up establishing a good relationship with them. Unlike previous missionaries she had met, they were not interested in pushing Portugal's interests, and Nzinga saw a way to have her rule legitimized, in a way the Portuguese would be unable to ignore. If she could develop a relationship with Rome through the two friars and be seen as a legitimate Christian leader by the Pope, the Portuguese would have to leave her alone. From 1650, she began to incorporate more and more Christian icons and rituals into her existing Ndongan ones. Crosses were placed in positions of high honour at her court, and she established several churches across her lands. Understandably, not all her courtiers were happy about her persistence that they should also convert, and there was resistance to it. But in typical style, Nzinga ordered her Christian priests to burn the temples of those who argued with her, and many prominent Mbandu and Imbangala priests were sent away as slaves. By this point, Nzinga had been at war with Portugal for nearly 25 years, and in 1651, earnest peace negotiations were finally sought. In 1656, a peace treaty was finally agreed upon. Nzinga agreed to cede some lands and to allow Portuguese traders inside Matamba, while the Portuguese agreed to give some lands back to her and return her remaining sister Cambu, who was now also known as Barbara. While other terms meant Nzinga was seen to be giving in to many demands made by the Portuguese, their recognition of her as the true ruler of Ndongo gave her great credibility. Finally, peace had been wrought between the two sides. In the years after the war, now in her early 70s, Nzinga seemed to soften and encourage a cultural blossoming of her court. While she had regained most of her ancestral lands, Ndongo had been ravaged, and few people lived there. Instead, she threw her energy into making Matamba the economic gateway to Central Africa. She also resettled former enslaved people, all while Matamba was the capital of the slave trade for the region and allowed women to give birth inside her camps, something that had been banned under wartime Imbangala laws. Nzinga also returned to a more feminine style of dress, importing beautiful fabrics from Europe and encouraging education in place of military training. She also dismissed her concubines, marrying her favourite in a Christian ceremony. But by now, the once athletic, sprightly queen was getting old, and her mind turned to who would succeed her. Doing away with the traditional methods of allowing the council to choose the next ruler from her royal relatives, Nzinga instead named her sister Kambu as the heir to her throne. Nzinga was mainly worried that much of her Christian conversion work would be undone in the wrong hands, and Kambu was a solid choice to prevent that. In October 1663, now 80 years old, Nzinga fell ill with an infection and took to her bed. Just a few months later, the infection had spread, and she died in her sleep on the 17th of December. Her burial was resplendent with both Catholic and Mbundu traditions and iconography, and her sister took the throne as Queen Barbara. Nzinga left behind a complex and tangled legacy. Her native Angola would forever see her as the warrior queen who had fought for their independence, and in 1961 she became an important icon of freedom during the Angolan War of Independence. She is still remembered as Mother Angola, a protector of her people. But for Western stories told of her throughout the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, they relied heavily on the racist slants typical of Western depictions of Africa at that time, as well as misogynistic depictions of women in their own cultures. Portuguese sources would remember Nzinga as a capable and strong leader who converted to Christianity, but other European sources would focus only on her brutality, sexuality, and supposed cannibalism. She was depicted as an unnatural creature, a woman driven by sexual desire to commit evil deeds, who had unbalanced her kingdom by her morally unlawful demand that she be a queen in place of a king. In the 20th century, historians finally began to take a more balanced view of her life. Nzinga committed terrible crimes, such as murdering her rivals, even if children or relatives, and contributing hugely to the formation of the African-European slave trade. But this should be contrasted not to later Western ideas of African nations, but to other European rulers in the same time period. Many dynasties, such as the Tudors, would become renowned for their executions and bloody persecution of varying religious ideals. Others, such as the Habsburgs, would be renowned for their dogged torture and persecution of anyone they deemed not Catholic. But unlike Nzinga, these rulers would not suffer from the later racist depictions of the African savage, would not have their achievements overlooked despite their murders. Nzinga was also a skilled politician, understanding when to flatter and when to combine a culture with her own in order to help her people survive. She was a highly effective military leader, holding her own against the might of the Portuguese forces and bouncing back from defeats with a steadfast stubbornness. As a queen, she never lost sight of her goal to regain her homeland, and once war was finished, she chose to create a new peaceful kingdom, rather than continue in a tradition of training for war and fighting. Queen Nzinga's legacy is a complicated one, but she remains to this day a symbol of freedom, fierceness and independence for many. She adapted the role of a man for herself, shaping it into her own, and rejecting the idea that being female could hamper her in any way, not unlike Elizabeth I of England, who was a contemporary. While Nzinga may have committed bloody crimes, she was an adept leader and ruler of her kingdoms, equal to any from the rest of the known world at that time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.